Welcome to CBSE English Tutorial, a visual guide.
All right, today we're jumping right into the complex, often controversial, and let's be honest, absolutely fascinating world of the interview. We're going to use Christopher Silvester's classic chapter as our map to figure this all out. So let's get into it.
Just listen to this quote to start us off. From the novelist Saul Bellow, he described the feeling of being interviewed as like thumbprints on his windpipe. Wow. It's such a violent, suffocating image, right? And it perfectly captures the high-stakes debate we're about to get into.
And that really is the central question here. Is the interview a noble art form? A way to find truth and get to know the people shaping our times? Or is it something much, much darker, an unwelcome intrusion, maybe even a kind of assault? So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at that core conflict. Then we'll hear from some very loud celebrity critics. After that, we're going to meet a scholar who totally flipped the script. We'll learn his secret of interstitials. And finally, we'll solve the mystery of his blockbuster novel.
Okay, so let's dive right in and deconstruct this central conflict. You have to understand, for more than 130 years, ever since the interview became a staple of journalism, it has been a total battlefield of opinion.
On one side, you've got people who think it's the best tool we have. They see it as an art form, our number one source of truth, the way we get these really vivid pictures of the people in our world. But then you have the other side, and they see it as a total violation, an intrusion that actually diminishes a person, almost like they believe it's stealing a part of their soul.
Now let's really dig into that negative view for a minute by listening to some of the people who felt most attacked by it, the celebrity critics. For them, this wasn't just some small annoyance. It was a deep personal assault.
And they did not hold back. V.S. Naipaul said that people are literally wounded by interviews, that they lose a part of themselves. Lewis Carroll, the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland, had a just horror of the whole thing. H.G. Wells just called it an ordeal. But maybe the harshest of all was Rudyard Kipling. He called it immoral, a crime, cowardly, vile, and said it deserves to be punished.
So you have these literary legends just trashing the interview in the strongest possible terms. But here's the question. Were they always so consistent? Did they practice what they preached?
Well, not exactly. It turns out that Rudyard Kipling, the same man who called it a vile crime, had actually conducted what he would later call an assault on Mark Twain. And this just shows you how complicated and maybe even a little hypocritical this whole debate really is.
Okay, so we've heard from the critics. Now let's totally flip the script and talk about someone who offers a completely different perspective. A guy who wasn't a victim of the interview, but an absolute master of it. The scholar, Umberto Eco. Before he was famous for his novels, you have to understand, Eco was an academic titan. He was a professor in Italy, a world-class expert on semiotics, that's the study of signs and symbols, and he'd published over 40 super dense scholarly works. Then, almost like a hobby, he became a best-selling novelist.
And this is how he saw himself, which is so important. He said, "I am a professor who writes novels on Sundays." He wasn't a novelist who happened to teach. He was a scholar first and foremost. His whole identity was wrapped up in academia.
So the big question is, how did this ridiculously busy professor find the time to also write these huge best-selling novels? Well, he had a secret, a whole philosophy of time he called interstices. So what are interstices? The definition is actually really simple. They're just the little empty spaces in our day. The small gaps and intervals between the big things we have to do. We all have them. And most of us, well, we just waste them.
But not Eco. He put them to work. He explained that just like the universe is filled with empty spaces, so are our lives. And his whole secret was just filling those little gaps with something productive.
He gave this perfect example in an interview. He said to the journalist, basically, okay, imagine you're coming to my apartment. You're in the elevator, and I'm waiting for you. That waiting time, that's an interstice. It's an empty space. And while waiting for you to come up from the first floor to the third, I have already written an article. It's such a brilliant way to explain the concept, right? So this same guy, this super productive scholar who works in empty spaces, then goes on to create a massive literary mystery. The insane, completely unexpected success of his novel, The Name of the Rose. And this was the question that stumped everybody. I mean, how on earth did this really serious, incredibly dense novel about medieval history and theology and metaphysics capture a massive mainstream audience? And we are not talking about a small success here. The book sold over 10 million copies. That's a scale that nobody, especially not his own publisher, ever thought was possible for such a challenging book. So what was the secret sauce? Well, Ego explained there were a few things. First, it worked as a great detective story on the surface, but underneath it had all this intellectual depth. And maybe most importantly, it totally shattered this belief that publishers had that people only want to read trash. Ego proved people were hungry for something challenging. And, he also admitted the timing was just perfect. It might have been a total flop 10 years earlier or later. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, Umberto Eco's life and his work, it just shows that he was completely in command of his own story, his own narrative. And that idea of command is so key when we circle back to his feelings about the interview. And this brings us right back to that core debate. You have the critics who see the interview as something that takes from them, that diminishes them. But then you have the Eco example, which shows something else is possible. For him, the interview wasn't an attack. It was a chance to explain the single philosophical idea that connected everything he did, from his academic work to his kids' books. So maybe the crucial point is this. The interview isn't inherently good or bad. Its power, its impact, its whole function, it seems to all come down to one simple question. Who is really in control of the story? Is it the interviewer, or is it the person being interviewed? Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Is an interview just a mirror, something that reflects a person as they already are? Or is it more like a spotlight, an intense light that by its very nature changes the person it's trying to illuminate? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for watching. See you again in a bit.